there are many opportunities that South Africans have missed out on because of our race-based laws.
The security crisis, where people just don't rely on the police anymore or on the justice system, but there are all these hired private security companies, and if you don't have those, then you are left in a state of anarchy.
Our private security forces are double the size of the police and the army combined.
Imagine that.
It would be unthinkable for people not to have access to private security. And the police aren't very well regarded at all. They're not. It's not that you would see a police person and say, "Oh, I'm in danger. Let me go and speak to this person." You probably try and avoid them because they might.
Guys, so recently I've seen a lot of video about many South Africans really worried and scared about this. I don't know if it's a policy that is being drafted allegedly though, but that it seems that security, private security, seems to become now a threat, or I don't know, but probably it will be taken away. So in other words, a lot of South Africans who have lost trust in the police protecting them, or the feeling of safety by the police, and trying to adopt private security to really augment their security apparatus in South Africa, that possibility might now have to be taken out. And I think that's a little bit tricky, because I remember I was listening to Mchandla Kwanazi's briefing 2 days ago or thereabout on how safe South Africans feel in South Africa. And I think from his perspective, he actually explained that, there are many people, especially in the region of KZN, but probably he speaks about for wider South Africa, a lot of people still do not feel like the police got their back in South Africa. You could hear from my video with the Sama Sambit yesterday, when he actually alluded to the fact that he might be able to afford security. So in other words, security now has become a part of the daily requirement for many people in South Africa. And this is now private security. And, if that isn't owned or kind of like acquired, so to speak, then it might be difficult to have that from the police for many people. And we see that in the frequency. I think Kwanazi made some really daring statements yesterday that I was really shocked on the kind of statistics he was giving in terms of the kind of like the frequency of crime in South Africa. The numbers were really worrying to me when he said, I think in the video, I'll be making a video about this anyway. He said, so I think from the analysis of the KZN region, he argued that there was a record of 4,000 cases of murder, and he was really appalled by that. Let's quickly watch him break down some of these statistics.
So therefore, our discussion was centered around what happened between April last year and December last year. So as we're looking overall crime, we're seeing a decrease in overall on all the 17 community-reported crimes. However, as much as the decrease is there, especially on murders, as much as there's a over 500 cases decrease, we're still worried with regard to the number of cases that we have registered, which are over 4,000 cases. Over 4,000 cases of murder is just too many, because we look at it and try and see how best can we move towards the figures that we last saw in 2020, where we had cases that are just about 3,000 or less. So we are driving towards that as a South African Police Service in KwaZulu-Natal. So that is the main. Yes, we are seeing a decrease on cases of rape as well in the province, but again, we still account for a lot of people that have been raped, over 5,000 of them. That is not acceptable.
So you could hear from him. He argues that they've recorded 5,000 rapes and 4,000 cases of murder. And this is actually sort of like what actually feels like a crime scene, and with a police that probably might not be able to cater for the large outbreak of these kinds of cases. I think there was a video with Clement Mayatela, and I think the judge president of I don't remember now if it was the Eastern Cape anyway, but he was actually asserting the fact that there were too many cases in the court and less number of judges. In other words, so the number of judges available to hear those cases are not able to meet to the number of crimes or cases that are coming to the court. And so a lot of people in South Africa, it's easy to just give up and be like, if I encounter some kind of crime or some kind of crime happens to me, there's no point reporting because I'm not able to get the required justice and all that. And at the end of the day, a lot of apathy sits in. So a lot of people now in South Africa have decided to get private security. And now it's actually being argued allegedly that it seems that private security might be taken away from many people, and that's causing a lot of tension. I hear from your comments and all of that. So right now, Oppenheimer here, Mark Oppenheimer, is actually briefing this really popular American journalist about these eventualities and probably this might actually be one of the kind of like basis for Donald Trump to be making these kinds of decisions he's making recently regarding South Africa. So he speaks about how the lack of protection in South Africa actually exists, and that in South Africa there are private security bodies, right? That are the number of private security bodies might actually be double or of the police and the army combined in South Africa. Bro, that's crazy. You'll be hearing the details as he breaks down the numbers in this video with this US journalist. He actually speaks about how South Africans seem to have lost trust in the police. The same police, SAPS that Mchanla Nkwanaz in KZN is trying to build the trust. But he actually speaks that generally it seems that, South Africans have lost trust in the police. Fisama Sambit yesterday in my podcast with him actually argues that, he speaks about how, the fitness qualification to join the police in South Africa is not encouraging from his perspective as a Gen Z in South Africa. He speaks about the mental capacity is not encouraging for him. And so it actually appears that, because of the hardship that many South Africans have actually experienced in South Africa, whenever they go abroad as emigrants, so to speak, they actually prosper because of the difficulties they've actually seen in South Africa. So a lot of facts Mark Oppenheimer is dropping in this video, and this US journalist is so shocked and stunned. And this is actually the kind of shock that many West Africans also see when they hear about the details going on in South Africa. It's huge. We don't know South Africa, and so we're going to keep studying. But let's quickly watch this video between Mark Oppenheimer and this US journalist, really break down some of the details about the importance or necessity for private security in South Africa, and also the fact of why South Africans seem to have lost trust in the police, SAPS, South African Police Service. And share your thoughts, guys, in the comments.
And then you also have the energy crisis. In terms of, let me talk about mismanagement of resources. I was reading about the power. So I grew up in Africa, and I was very much used to, no electricity, no running water, all of that, except most of us envied South Africa because we thought that is the country that will join the first world or will join the developed world. And it was very tragic to read about how the man-made energy crisis of South Africa. Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
It's totally tragic. So it's one of those things that was entirely foreseeable and preventable. We've had rolling blackouts since 2007. And Eskom, the sort of power utility, had warned the government of the day to say, look, we've got economic growth, you've got development, you need to have more power, and you need to invest in a variety of different sources. And the ANC government refused. So we then had rolling blackouts, which have intensified quite dramatically in the last couple of years. I argued a case about how the ANC's policy of what's called cadre deployment, which is to install their own officials in various government departments, had gutted the quality of these services. And I pointed out that every single day of that year, we had load shedding or power outs. I then bumped into my opponent about 8 months later, and I said to him, I need to apologize. If I had to argue the case now, I'd say that every single day but one had load shedding. So for 8 solid months, we had power outs. The last couple of months have been better, but we've had a spate of it recently. One of the problems with power outs, of course, is that it's very difficult to run a business. The cost of installing generators and solar, which a lot of people have done, is exorbitant. And then it has knock-on effects. So we've had not just power outs, but water outs quite regularly.
Yeah.
So when you have no water, you're going to have a sanitation crisis. And so good friends of mine will regularly have no water for days. And this is not good for a harmonious society or a flourishing society.
Mm-hmm. And you also have no security. That was another big item in terms of reports of South Africa, but you have to dig through loads of information to find out about what's going on there, which is the security crisis, where people just don't rely on the police anymore or on the justice system, but there are all these hired private security companies, and if you don't have those, then you are left in a state of anarchy.
Undoubtedly. So our private security forces are double the size of the police and the army combined.
Imagine that.
It would
Yeah.
be unthinkable for people not to have access to private security. And the police aren't very well regarded at all. They're not. It's not that you would see a police person and say, "Oh, I'm in danger. Let me go and speak to this person." You probably try and avoid them because they might extort you for a bribe.
Yeah.
Whereas private security are very well regarded. As I say, the private sector in South Africa is world class, and there's a sense in which we're an anti-fragile society. So, South Africans that go abroad prosper because they've been used to so many difficulties. If you have to work out, how to prosper in an environment where you don't have regular water, power, police force, when your public, school education is, in tatters, and so you have to build your own private schools. You wind up being quite a resourceful, impressive person.
And you have the most famous South African / American, Elon Musk, and he was embroiled in a conflict with the South African government. What's that about? And did you represent him?
Yes. So one of the things that Elon Musk has done, I think, is shine a bit of a spotlight on some of the things that South Africa has been doing. In a sense, things have recently come to quite a head. So there's two issues. The one is Elon has a business called Starlink, which provides low-cost internet to rural areas. It would be a real boon for many South Africans. And one of the requirements for him to launch that business in South Africa would be to have 30% of the business owned by Black South Africans. And Elon has said, I'm not willing to do that. It sort of really would just be a tax on the business, and you're a foreign entity. So there's been that sort of public clash. And there are many opportunities that South Africans have missed out on because of our race-based laws. The other one is that because of Mr. Musk's close relationship with President Trump, an executive order recently came out condemning the situation in South Africa and pointing out a few different things. The one is the signing of the Expropriation Act, which gives government this power to confiscate land. That Expropriation Act is really the end of a very long story. So the ANC had tried to amend our constitution to allow for expropriation without compensation. And they referred to landed improvement. So it would have included people's private homes, for example. And they thankfully failed in that effort, but nonetheless persisted in passing this law, which would be unconstitutional on its face. That was the one trigger. The other one is South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice against Israel, which, upsetting one of America's greatest allies is obviously not a good idea for South Africa. I also think it's a morally repugnant thing to have done. In South Africa, that litigation was cheerleaded by our press, and there was a sort of line of South Africa's back on the global stage as the morally courageous country that it's always been. We're remembering the glory days of Mandela, and we're holding the terrible genocide years in Israel to account, and the Israelis practice apartheid, and we've lived through apartheid, so we need to sanction them for that. The other things that South Africans love are being in the sporting stage, so we're very keen on rugby and cricket and soccer, and have won a number of international awards. And so this was treated as the latest sporting event where we must rally behind Team South Africa, who are on the global stage. I think I was the only South African lawyer to publicly rebuke South Africa's case at the ICJ because it's ultimately a blood libel against a state that is defending itself against terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite strange that South Africa would involve itself in that Middle Eastern conflict. There's no geographical proximity. It made me wonder, how big is the pro-Palestinian, or more precisely, how big is the Muslim population in South Africa that is Islamist, or that you would consider what we in America call extremist? And what would they know about Israel, other than what every Islamist is told, which is to pray for the destruction of the Jews?
Yes, so it's a complicated relationship. I, before October 7th, did a big public debate with Mohammed Hijab. Now, Mohammed Hijab would go on to say some of the most terrible things after October 7th, but we were having a discussion about the morality of Islam.
So who is Mohammed Hijab?
Mohammed Hijab is, I think, very well known in the UK as being a popularizer of Islamic thought, and produces a series of arguments in favor of why Islam is a true faith, but also has been a strong anti-Zionist activist.
And is he a South African?
No, he's British.
Okay.
So he'd sort of made his career on Speaker's Corner. I think that video has been viewed about 1 million times. So it's a very big presence. He was on Piers Morgan. But the person who was South African who'd invited Mr. Hijab out, we bumped into each other after October 7th and had a conversation. He said to me, his father was a lawyer, and his father had looked for articles to get a job during apartheid. And every firm whose door he knocked on said no, except for the Jewish firms. And so his father, trained with Jews, and there was quite a close relationship between Muslims and Jews during apartheid in various sectors. And there has been good relationships at times. But there is a radical fringe. And unfortunately, that radical fringe has gotten involved in a number of our important institutions. So, for example, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, like the Secretary of State, Naledi Pandor, after October 7th, had a phone call with Iran, met with Hamas. So Hamas members were invited to South Africa, and they met there. And you had this very strong Islamist approach that South Africa for a while sort of would take a kind of milquetoast approach to Israel, which is two-state solution, and then suddenly that shifted. So there are a number of radical elements in the government, and then also at other institutions. So I'm a member of the University of Cape Town's council, which is the body that regulates the university, and that university passed an academic boycott against Israeli academics. And that's because you've had a number of Islamist elements take control of that institution, terrorize those who would want to take a reasonable position, trample on academic freedom. So you have those sorts of things that are ongoing. There have been a number of quite terrible anti-Semitic elements that have happened. So there's an Israeli Apartheid Week that occurs at South African universities, and Jewish students were surrounded by mobs and told that we are Hamas. So you would have students shouting at them, we are Hamas. You'd have Israeli flags being burnt. There was a woman who carried an Israeli flag outside of Parliament, and she's in her 70s. She's quite a well-known Hebrew teacher in Cape Town, and she was assaulted for holding that flag. So you have a number of these sorts of incidences that have occurred.
A friend of my husband's, who's South African and who is Jewish, said he felt increasingly that Jews in South Africa felt threatened because of this combination of radical communists and radical Islamists and their collaboration. And he thought that the Islamist footprint from Iran was much larger than is reported on. Not that anything is reported on from South Africa.
I think that's likely to be the case. So what's an interesting sort of backstory to why South Africa joined the ICJ case is that it was done just before our elections. And the ANC were in enormous financial difficulties. They owed a lot of money. And then suddenly, miraculously, their debts were paid after having had this phone call with the Iranians. A big South African company, a big telecoms company, operates in Iran called MTN. So there's a view that money was basically siphoned through MTN to pay off the ANC's debts. The South African taxpayer paid for the litigation with the ICJ. It was a very expensive litigation. It ultimately wasn't a vote getter for the ANC. As I say, they plummeted in the polls. A lot of South Africans are Christians and religious, and I think have a fondness for Israel. But you have these radical fringes that have managed to control the loudheaders in the press and in the government and in our tertiary institutions.